have, like many other PMs, had a bit of a windy road to product. And I've always really considered myself a numbers person. I've tended to gravitate towards the types of roles that allow me to kind of lean into that. So some of the areas that I've worked in that I've been particularly proud of, I supported hospitals across Canada with optimizing their resources. So in some situations, that was figuring out how best to allocate beds across different services. In some cases, that looked like COVID decampment strategies. And in some cases, that looked like capital plans. We're looking to build a new hospital. How big should it be? I've recently worked in the digital transformation arm of a mining organization, specifically in the maintenance space. So you have these multi-million-dollar assets. How do we make sure we're maximizing the uptime while minimizing that maintenance cost? Currently, I work in the food services space, so I'm supporting Compass Digital. That's the digital transformation arm of Compass North America. And Compass refers to themselves as the biggest company you've never heard of. So we run about $25 billion a year through our cafes. And my product in particular is Distiller. So Distiller takes all that data associated with those cafe sales and packages it up for the CPG brands. So let's say you're Coca-Cola, for example. It might be helpful for you to better understand what are the innovations coming up in the beverage space? How do people change their beverage patterns by time of day, by demographic, by location? What do people typically like to consume when they're consuming beverages? So are they going for chocolate bars? Are they going for chips? Are they going for salads? And how is that changing over time? And then finally, how does your positioning compare to that of your competitors? Is that positioning strategy that you're working so hard for, is it working? And how can you close that gap? So now let's dive into data products. So I'm going to be talking a lot about data products today, so I should probably define what that means. A lot of people refer to data products as kind of databases, models, APIs within the organization that are kind of internal tools that other people might use to support some of what they're doing. Instead, I'm going to kind of tweak the definition a little bit to be a user-facing tool that drives knowledge, that helps to answer questions. So why do I consider these sort of separate from other products? A lot of product management philosophy and product management thinking is really centered around task management. How do we support people in most efficiently accomplishing a task? So if you think about Amazon, for instance, the task might be you want to find the thing you're looking to purchase and you want to get it to your house as quickly as possible. Whereas with data tools, this task accomplishment is typically secondary. Instead of trying to help people accomplish something, we're trying to help them answer questions to make better decisions. And so I think a user focus is still so fundamental to what we're doing here. But at the same time, we need to bring in some other considerations that aren't typically thought about. So I want to start with one of the best tools for understanding our users, personas. Obviously, even with these data tools, we want to understand who they are, what matters to them, what sucks for them. But on top of all that, I think there are a few key things that we want to consider when we're looking at these data tools. I talk a lot to my teams about meeting users where they are, specifically around things like data acumen, the types of tooling you're going to build for an analyst, someone who really wants to get in the weeds, really wants to understand the numbers, and if we're being honest, probably pull the data out of your tool and put it into their tool of choice, is going to be really, really different than, a C-suite executive or even a really busy manager. Even though they might have the ability to go through the data or even the desire to, they probably don't have the time. So figuring out how we can serve up those findings and those insights on a silver platter for them, those journeys are going to be so different. Additionally, you want to consider how comfortable are your users with the data sets you're pulling from? Do they understand the limitations? Do they understand what's in versus what's out? Or are you going to have to create kind of an educational journey to help them understand that? And then finally, trust. Trust comes up over and over again in product management. But I think especially here, we are just going to be showing a lot of information, a lot of numbers to our users. Are they going to expect to see the math because they're not sure you're looking at it the right way? Or are they going to buy it at face value? We'll be talking about this a little bit more later on, but this can really influence the type of solutions you go after. If you're thinking about some of those deep neural networks, you don't really have that auditability. You don't, it's really hard to be able to say, this is why we got this result out of this model. So understanding if your users will buy it or if you need something that does have more transparency is really key to selecting that solution. I also think that we should be looking for great opportunities for how data can support these individuals. So, some of the areas I tend to look are really high value decisions. So, the ones that maybe aren't made that often, but have a lot of risk associated with them, often monetary risk, that are pretty complex and that are one way doors, decisions that once they implement it, they can't come back from. The opposite side of the spectrum is those really repetitive tasks, the ones that are just eating up hours and hours of people's weeks, months, quarters as they try and get all this information together. Chances are we can probably automate a good chunk of that. I also like to talk to the organizations I work with about these legendary moments. Those moments where, an analyst brought forward a finding or a report surfaced something that changed the trajectory of what we were trying to do. And how did they come to that conclusion? How did it kind of happen within the org? Those stories can tell us so much about what these organizations value and how they're using data. So, the other key tool that I like to focus on in research and discovery is user journeys. So, again, user journeys are a very well known tool within the product management space. But instead of looking at how someone has accomplished a task, we want to better understand how someone has reached a conclusion, has made a decision. And once again, look at where those pain points are arising versus where those payoffs are coming. Some things that I really like to keep in mind when we're creating data products and we're looking at user journeys, I like to start with what makes it hard. I always work from the assumption that if this were easy, we probably would have done it already. So there's some complexity there, no matter how simple people make it sound. There are edge cases, there's business logic you need to build in. And peeling that away is really going to support you in building something that excites your customers. I also like to map out where in the decision stream you have a lot of data and where the decision making is really well supported with data, how accessible that data is versus where you're making assumptions and guesses. Chances are, if the data is readily accessible and if people are using it already, any product you build in that space isn't going to add a lot of value versus looking at the assumptions and guesses, that area might be really ripe for support. One way I like to look at this in particular is by interviewing, the more senior folks in the organization versus the more junior, the newer folks. I tend to find that if people are talking about, I can make this decision faster because I can rely on my gut. I know this industry inside and out. That gut is really just a very complex model, right? They're taking in lots of information, they're consuming it, and they're creating an output. If we can take a lot of that thinking and bake it into what we're doing, we can onboard these more junior individuals faster into making better decisions sooner. There's also a lot we have to consider when we're thinking about these tools in terms of reporting requirements. Are there regulatory requirements you need to adhere to, or even just business standards? You also want to take a look at industry best practice. So, what do people call a specific metric? How do they typically calculate that? What's the language they use to make sure that when you're coming out with something, it's already kind of speaking in their language? Again, building that trust that you kind of get it. And then, what are the communication channels? So, as you probably got a flavor for, I work a lot in the B2B space. The way people communicate in the B2B space is primarily the Microsoft suite. So we need to consider that when we're looking at integrations, how people are actually going to pull this data out and consume it versus what a lot of us tend to use, which aren't necessarily the Microsoft suite. Last but not least, I'm a big proponent of just sitting down with these really smart folks, potential users, and going through their computer, all the reports they've written, all the reports they've received, and I take as many home as I can. I find this gives me so much insight into what matters to them, how they're prioritizing things, and how they're thinking about this type of data. Next, I want to talk a bit about solutioning. Again, I think a lot of this comes back to product fundamentals, but I see people fall into these traps far more often in data tooling than I do in other spaces. So I think it's worth calling out. The first is just being really cautious of building exactly what any user asks for. I think everyone who has played in this space has that situation where you're working with a really smart stakeholder who really knows their stuff, and they kind of draw something out on a page and they say, if you could just give me this, that's all I need. And you look at it and you go, yeah, that's hard, but we can do that. We can deliver that. And then as soon as you give it to them, they go, now that I look at it, it's not quite there. It's not quite answering my question. This is a really frustrating situation. It creates a ton of scope creep and kind of leaves everyone dissatisfied. Whereas I find if we can really deeply understand the why, that allows us to bring in those really smart folks from data science, analytics, insights, those kick-ass analysts and data visualization experts, bring everyone to the table and talk about how we can potentially solve this problem, which often, in my experience, goes way above and beyond people's expectations because we're not just limited by what they know the tooling can do. We're taking the advice of experts in this space and pushing it to its limits. I also like to bring in engineering early and often for these conversations. Often when we're prototyping these tools, we're starting with a subset of the data just to get something out there and to validate. But the way you're going to build a production-ready tool for 10,000 rows of data versus 10 million or even billions of rows of data dramatically changes how you're going to build it and potentially the feasibility. Again, running a model on 10,000 rows is going to be much less expensive than running potentially the same model on millions or billions of rows. Does that change the cost benefit analysis, and does it still make your product viable? I also want to talk a little bit about tools in your toolkit. So I think there's just so much really exciting stuff happening in the data space right now. And I want to just provide people with some cautions. So BI tools versus custom builds is where I kind of want to start. I'm a big fan of leveraging BI tools to get something up there, check with your users, experiment, try new things. They're low code, it's very simple. But I have never worked on a product where we didn't reach kind of a wall of functionality, where we knew exactly how we wanted to build a solution, but we couldn't because we didn't own the stack. My recommendation in those cases is as soon as you start feeling that friction, start considering a custom build. The problems aren't going to get better. They're probably going to get worse over time. And the sooner you can get ahead of it, the less you're going to have to migrate over. I also want to talk about AI, the topic that we've all kind of been considering today. I am so excited by what's happening in this space, and I will be the first to admit that I cannot wait to start playing with it. But I am really cautious. I see a lot of firms kind of looking around for how AI can support them. And I am a big believer that we need to start with problems and use the simplest solution to solve that problem. You know, whether that's basic analytics, a regression model, 100 if statements, this provides greater transparency, it costs less, and it requires less data than some of these bigger models. Now, obviously, if there's a problem that you just never had the tools to solve until some of these innovations come out, go for it. Like, that is a great use case, and keep me posted. I'd love to hear how it goes. But I think we need to be really wary of just throwing some of these new innovations at every problem. And last but not least, I want to close the loop and talk about once we've developed something, how do we gauge its success? So when we think about, again, these task accomplishment tools, so things like Amazon, it's pretty easy to see if we're making strides, if we're moving the needle in the way we expect. We can see if more people are coming to the pages. We can see if they're adding to cart. We can see if they're checking out. How can you tell if you're making people smarter? So I think this just takes more creativity, if I'm being honest. I'm gonna outline a couple ways that I've seen this done or I've done this in the past, but I would encourage people just to be thoughtful about it. Any of these leading indicators are gonna be better than the lagging indicators, typically ARR, if you're looking at SaaS products. So a few things I would encourage you to think about. Engagement is an easy one to take a look at. Are people coming in? More importantly, are they using some of those integrations, some of those tools that you've built to bring data back into their organizations? You can also measure, in some cases, if they're making better decisions. I think this is particularly good for some of those optimization problems where you can look retroactively and say, what would a perfect decision have looked like versus the decision we made? And is that gap getting smaller over time? Is it staying the same or is it getting wider? And then finally, one that I see a lot of people go to is, are we driving key business outcomes? Sometimes that's to increase revenue, sometimes that's to decrease costs. This one I'm always a little wary of. I think it's kind of the be all end all. And if you can find ways to really particularly slice how your product is driving that outcome, great. I think it is the ideal state. But more often, I find it's really hard to peel away how your product is supporting versus what typically is the many other initiatives that are playing in that space. And the last thing you want to do is accidentally take credit with your product for someone else's hard work. So I think this one can be a little tricky politically if you're not careful. So that's kind of it. In summary, I think a lot of this comes back to the product fundamentals, how we deliver things, how we put our users first, and how we kind of develop, measure, and iterate.